Miss Bewley, you are freezing. Please.
Your Grace,
Allow me. You are safe now.
I cannot stand.
I have you.
She was on her knees in the snow, not dancing inside the glittering ballroom where hundreds of candles burned warm and bright, not laughing behind a silk fan like the other ladies, not seated at a dinner table with a full plate and a polished smile. She was outside, in the freezing cold, on the ground, her bare hands pressed into the snow, her thin gown offering nothing against the brutal winter wind. Her lips had gone pale. Her body shook so hard she could barely lift her head. And nobody had noticed she was gone. Nobody except him. Duke Ashton Callery had stepped out for air, tired of the noise and the politics wrapped inside every polite conversation at his own estate. He had not expected to find a young woman collapsed near the garden gate, half hidden by the hedge, as if she had crawled there, hoping no one would see her. He crossed the frozen ground in 3 long strides and dropped to one knee beside her. "Who did this to you?" His voice came out low, almost dangerous. She looked up at him with eyes that were glassy and exhausted and full of something he could not immediately name. Not fear, not shame. Something older than both. Something that looked like she had stopped expecting anyone to come. He pulled off his coat without thinking and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. She flinched at the warmth like it surprised her. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried. She failed. He caught her before she hit the ground again. He carried her inside without a single word to the stunned crowd that parted around him. Whispers flew like sparks. Fans snapped open. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The music actually stopped. But Duke Callery did not look at any of them. He looked only at her. And when she finally whispered the reason she had been left outside in the cold, something shifted behind his eyes. Something quiet and terrifying, the way a storm looks calm right before it destroys everything in its path. His fury, when it came, would shake the very walls of his estate. But that is a story for right now. Who do you think put her outside in that cold? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. And if this opening already has your heart racing, please hit the subscribe button. You do not want to miss what comes next.
For it is too late.
The Winter Ball at Callery Estate was the most talked about event of the season. Every lord, lady, and titled guest within 3 counties had received an invitation stamped with the Callery seal, a golden falcon pressed into deep red wax. The estate itself had been transformed. Every hallway glowed, every chandelier dripped with crystal. The grand staircase was lined with white roses imported at great expense, and the smell of warm, spiced wine drifted through every room like a gentle promise that tonight would be remembered. Nobody paid attention to the girl carrying the extra candles. Thomasine Bewley moved through the crowds with her eyes down and her steps quiet. She was not a servant exactly, though she was treated like one. She was the ward of Lord Percival Drummond, a man who had taken her in after her father's death 7 years ago, and had spent every year since making sure she understood the exact weight of that favor. She owed him everything, he always said. Her food, her shelter, her very breath. And she should be grateful. She was not grateful tonight. Tonight, she had been given a specific task. She was to carry fresh candles to the Upper East Corridor, refill the silver trays near the entrance hall, and then stand near the back of the ballroom in case Lady Drummond needed anything. She was not to dance. She was not to speak to guests unless spoken to first. She was absolutely not to draw attention to herself. Thomasine had followed every instruction perfectly for 7 years. She had learned to make herself invisible. She had learned to smile at the right moments and stay silent at the wrong ones. She had learned that the Drummond household had a language of its own, sharp looks, and cold silences and sudden rages that came from nowhere, and she had spent 7 years becoming fluent in all of it. But tonight felt different. She could not explain it exactly. Maybe it was the music, which was lovelier than anything she had heard before. Maybe it was the sight of all those women in their beautiful gowns, laughing freely, spinning on the arms of men who looked at them like they were worth something. Maybe it was the fact that she was 22 years old and had never once been asked to dance. She pressed the candles close to her chest and kept walking. Lord Percival Drummond stood near the fireplace in the main hall with a glass of brandy and the smile he wore when he wanted something. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and cold grey eyes that had never once looked at Thomasine with anything resembling warmth. Beside him stood his eldest daughter, Henrietta Drummond, who was beautiful and vicious in equal measure, and who had made Thomasine's life a quiet misery since the very first week she arrived at Drummond House. Henrietta was laughing at something one of her companions said. Her laugh was musical. Everything about her was designed to charm, her posture, her expressions, the way she tilted her head just so when a man of status walked by. But Thomasine knew what lived underneath that charm. She had felt it often enough. Across the room stood Victoire Alston, a widow of 30 with sharp cheekbones and sharper opinions, who was Henrietta's closest friend and fiercest ally. Victoire had a habit of saying cruel things in sweet tones, and then looking innocent when people flinched. She had decided years ago that Thomasine was beneath her notice, which was fine, because Thomasine had decided the same thing about her. The third woman in that group was younger, Dorinda Fassett, barely 19, the daughter of a baron with more debts than dignity. She was pretty in a fragile, uncertain way, and she followed Henrietta's lead in everything because she was too afraid not to. She had laughed at Thomasine once, at a dinner party 2 years ago, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Thomasine had not forgotten. None of them noticed when she slipped past them with her candles. None of them noticed when Lord Drummond leaned toward Victoire and said something in a low voice that made Victoire's eyes flick briefly toward the back of the room where Thomasine had just disappeared. None of them noticed the look that passed between Henrietta and her father after that. None of them, except Thomasine, who had spent 7 years learning to notice everything. She set the candles in the Upper East corridor and stood very still for a moment, pressing her back against the cold wall. She could hear the music swelling downstairs. She could hear the laughter rising and falling like a tide. She could hear the sound of the night being enjoyed by everyone who had been invited here as a guest rather than a burden. She allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of feeling it. The loneliness, the ache, the particular kind of sadness that comes from standing very close to something warm and beautiful and knowing it was never meant for you. Then she straightened her back, picked up her empty tray, and went back, downstairs. She did not see Henrietta slip away from the main hall. She did not see Victoire follow. She did not see Lord Drummond speak quietly to one of the footmen and press something into his palm. She walked through the side corridor toward the entrance hall, and the door at the end of the corridor opened ahead of her, and before she understood what was happening, she was outside. The cold hit her like a wall. It was not a gentle winter night. It was brutal, the kind of cold that had teeth that got inside your lungs and squeezed. The snow had been falling all evening, and it lay thick and white across the ground, glowing faintly in the light from the estate windows. The garden gate was 10 feet away, iron and frost covered. The door behind her clicked shut. She turned immediately and grabbed the handle, locked. She stood there for 1 stunned second, her mind refusing to accept it. Then she knocked. She knocked again. She pressed her ear to the door and heard nothing on the other side except the distant sound of music. She was in a thin indoor gown with no cloak, no gloves, and no way back in. She walked quickly along the side of the building, trying each door she came to. A servant's entrance, locked. a narrow gate that led further into the garden, not back toward the main entrance, a window with heavy curtains drawn tight on the inside. The cold was not waiting for her to find a solution. It was moving through her fabric, through her skin, settling into her bones with a patience that frightened her. She wrapped her arms around herself and kept moving, but her feet were already numb, and the snow was soaking through her thin slippers with every step. She made it to the garden gate before her legs gave out. She told herself she would rest for just a moment. Just until the shaking passed. Just until she could think clearly enough to decide what to do next. She did not know how long she knelt there. She only knew that when she finally heard footsteps crunching, through the snow, she had stopped feeling most of her fingers. She looked up. The man standing over her was tall, broad-shouldered. His formal coat was immaculate, his jaw set hard, and his eyes, when they found hers, were the dark, searching kind that did not look away quickly. She had seen his face before, from a distance, the way you see a painting in a gallery. Never up close. Never like this. Duke Ashton Callery looked down at her, with an expression she could not read, and then he dropped to one knee in the snow like it cost him nothing. Like a duke, kneeling in a snowbank was the most natural thing in the world, and he said in a voice that was low and careful and completely without performance, "Who did this to you?" She opened her mouth. And then she remembered where she was and who he was and what it would cost her to tell the truth inside a house full of people who had locked her out of it. She closed her mouth again. He did not push her. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her without asking permission, and the warmth of it was so sudden and so unexpected that her eyes filled before she could stop them. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, but the warmth undid something in her that the cold had not. He helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, and he kept one hand at her elbow, not gripping, just present, and they moved back toward the estate together. He did not ask her anything else. He did not make her explain herself in the freezing dark. He simply brought her inside, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the ballroom went quiet. Not all at once, in pieces. The music faltered. Conversations died. Heads turned. Every eye in the room landed on the Duke of Callery, walking through his own ballroom with his coat around the shoulders of a girl nobody of consequence had ever paid attention to. Thomasine felt every single stare. She kept her eyes straight ahead. Lord Percival Drummond, standing by the fireplace with his brandy, went very still. Henrietta Drummond, halfway across the room with Victoire at her elbow, felt the smile leave her face for the first time all evening. And somewhere near the back, a young footman named Garrett, who had been paid to lock that door, quietly folded his hands behind his back and prayed nobody was looking at him. Duke Callery guided Thomasine to a chair near the inner fire and called for warm tea and a blanket in a tone that made the nearest servant move at twice their usual speed. He crouched in front of her again so they were at eye level, which was not a thing a duke did, not in public, not ever, and he said quietly, "You will tell me what happened when you are ready, not before." She looked at him. He looked back, and in the firelight, with the entire room watching and pretending not to, Thomasine Bewley made a decision that would change everything. She decided to trust him. The tea came in a silver pot with a matching cup, and Thomasine wrapped both hands around it because her fingers were still learning how to feel again. The blanket across her shoulders was thick and smelled faintly of cedar, and the kind of warmth that belonged to rooms she had never been allowed to sit in. Duke Callery had not gone far. He stood a few feet away, speaking in a low voice to his head steward, a compact and efficient man named Birch, who had served the estate for over 20 years, and who wore his worry quietly but visibly. The Duke was not shouting. He was not making a scene. But there was a particular stillness about him that the people who knew him well understood was far more serious than noise. Birch nodded several times, then moved away quickly. Thomasine watched this from under her lashes, keeping her expression carefully neutral. She was used to watching rooms from the outside. She was good at it. She could read the temperature of a gathering the way a sailor reads weather, and what she read right now was that this room was charged with something that had not been here 20 minutes ago. People were still looking at her, not all of them with kindness. Lady Constance Marefield, a baroness of considerable standing and considerable opinions, had positioned herself near the opposite fireplace with two of her companions, the pinched and elegant Mrs. Odeline Prue and the younger but equally formidable Miss Beatrice Holt. All three of them were looking at Thomasine with the particular expression that well-bred women reserved for things that did not belong where they had appeared. "Drummond's ward," Lady Constance murmured, not particularly quietly. "I thought she was a servant." "Practically one," Mrs. Prue replied, touching the pearls at her throat. Miss Holt said nothing. She was watching the Duke, not Thomasine, and her expression was harder to categorize. She had been hoping for a particular kind of evening, the kind that ended with the Duke of Callery having noticed her. This development was not part of that plan. Across the room, Henrietta Drummond had recovered her composure. She was smiling again, which was worse than when she had not been smiling. Victoire stood at her shoulder, and the two of them were engaged in what looked like ordinary conversation, but was, if you knew how to read it, something closer to a rapid and urgent strategy meeting conducted entirely in undertones. "She is not hurt," Henrietta said quietly. "She is simply cold. It means nothing." "He brought her in himself," Victoire replied. "He would have done the same for a stray cat. He is that sort of man. He is crouching in front of her at a public ball, Henrietta." Henrietta's smile did not move. "It will pass. Men like Callery do not attach themselves to girls like her. She has nothing. She is nothing. By tomorrow morning, this will be an amusing story that nobody tells twice." Victoire was less certain, but said nothing more. Lord Percival Drummond had not moved from his place by the main fireplace. He was still holding his brandy. He had not taken a sip of it in several minutes. His grey eyes were fixed on his ward across the room, and the look in them was not guilt, and it was not concern. It was calculation, quiet and cold and very patient, the look of a man who had encountered an unexpected obstacle and was already working out how to remove it. Beside him, just arrived at his elbow, stood Sir Radley Pemstone, a man of middle age with a soldier's bearing and a merchant's instincts, which was a combination that had made him very wealthy and not particularly well liked. He was Lord Drummond's oldest ally, and had been for 15 years, which meant he was precisely as trustworthy as Lord Drummond himself, which was not at all. "Unfortunate timing," Sir Radley said, watching the Duke with narrowed eyes. "Manageable," Lord Drummond replied. "You should go to her. Show concern, it will look better." "If I go to her now, it looks like guilt. I will speak to her later, privately." He finally took a sip of his brandy. "She will say nothing. She never does." Sir Radley was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if she does?" Lord Drummond did not answer, but the look he gave Sir Radley was answer enough. The third man in their quiet orbit arrived a moment later. Viscount Grain, young for his title at 31, tall and pleasant-looking in a way that had fooled many people for many years. He had a way of making you feel warmly regarded that had very little to do with actually regarding you warmly. He glanced at Thomasine, then at the Duke, and then at Lord Drummond, with a small and careful smile. "Interesting evening," he said. "Stay close," Lord Drummond told him. Grain's smile did not change. He picked up a glass from a passing tray and settled in to watch. None of this was visible to most of the room. It was conducted in the fluent, invisible language of people who were practiced at maneuvering in public spaces. But Thomasine, who had spent 7 years watching that language being spoken in her own home, caught every syllable of it from across the ballroom. She looked away. Duke Callery returned to her side. He sat in the chair across from her, rather than looming over her, which she noticed, because men of his station did not usually think about how their height affected the people they were speaking to. "Better?" he asked. "Much," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "Good." He did not immediately follow it with a question. He let the silence sit for a moment, the way a patient man does, not filling it, just leaving the room. She had never met anyone who had left the room before. She looked at her tea. "I went outside for air," she said carefully. The door closed behind me. It was not a lie, exactly. It was a very carefully constructed version of the truth that left out everything important. She had become expert at those over the years. The Duke looked at her steadily. "The east corridor door locks from the inside with a bolt. It cannot close and lock itself." She did not respond. "Someone locked it," he said. Not an accusation. Not a question. Just a statement laid gently on the table between them for her to do with what she would. The silence stretched. Thomasine thought about 7 years of careful silence. She thought about what it had cost her, and what it had bought her, which was food and a roof and the daily understanding that both could be removed at any time. She thought about Lord Drummond's eyes across the room, patient and calculating. She thought about Henrietta's smile, which had come back. She thought about this man who had knelt in the snow. "I do not know who locked it," she said. It was, again, technically true. She suspected. She did not know. Something moved behind the Duke's eyes. Not disbelief exactly. More like the quiet recognition of someone who had heard a careful answer and understood all the things it was protecting. He nodded once. Then he said something she had not expected. "You are a guest in my home tonight, Miss Bewley," she said. "Thomasine Bewley. Miss Bewley." He said her name as though it mattered. "You are a guest in my home tonight. Not a servant, not a ward, not an obligation. And as my guest, no door in this estate will be locked against you again this evening. I will see to that personally." She stared at him. He said it so simply. Not as a grand gesture. Not as a performance for the watching room. Simply as a fact he was establishing, quietly and without drama, the way you establish facts that you intend to stand behind. She did not know what to do with that. She had been managing people's cruelty for so long that simple decency arrived like a language she had once known and almost forgotten. She nodded. "Thank you, Your Grace." He stood. "When you are warmer, I would be honored if you would accept a dance." The room did not go quiet this time, but several people near enough to hear. It went very still. Thomasine felt heat rise in her face for reasons that had nothing to do with the fire. "I am not dressed for dancing," she said. "You are dressed exactly as well as anyone here," he replied, and he said it with such complete and uncomplicated sincerity that she almost believed him. He left her to her tea and her thoughts, and moved back into the room, greeting a cluster of waiting guests with the ease of a man who had been trained from birth to do so. But twice, in the next 10 minutes, she caught him glancing back at her with an expression that she could not entirely decode. It was not a pity. She knew pity well enough to recognize its absence. She was still trying to name it when Dorinda Fassett appeared at her elbow, arriving with the careful casualness of someone who had been sent rather than come of her own accord. "That must have been frightening," Dorinda said, with the wide, sympathetic eyes she had practiced in the mirror. "Being locked out in the cold like that." Thomasine looked at her. "It was uncomfortable. Of course." Dorinda paused, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in her skirt. "Henrietta is worried about you, you know. She wanted me to ask if you needed anything." "I have tea," Thomasine said. "Yes." Another pause. She also wanted me to say that if you are thinking of speaking to anyone about tonight, it would only cause trouble. For you, mostly. You know how these things go. There it was, delivered in Dorinda's sweet, uncertain voice, wrapped in concern, containing a threat as clear as any Lord Drummond had ever made in plain language. Thomasine set down her cup. She looked at Dorinda for a long moment, long enough that the girl's rehearsed sympathy began to crack slightly at the edges. "Tell Henrietta," Thomasine said quietly, "that I had a lovely evening." Dorinda blinked. Then she left. Thomasine turned back to the fire. 3 feet away, just within hearing range, a young man she had not noticed before stood with a glass in his hand and an expression of barely concealed fury on his face. He was perhaps 25, with the bearing of someone raised to think carefully before speaking, and he was watching the direction Dorinda had gone with eyes that had heard everything. He caught Thomasine looking at him and gave her a small, serious nod. His name was Captain Phineas Rowe, and he was the Duke's closest friend, and he had just decided, quietly and completely, whose side he was on. Down by the main entrance, the fourth villain of the evening arrived 2 hours late, with ice on his boots and a story already prepared. Lord Bexham Tull swept into the ballroom with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own welcome, kissed the ring of every important hand within reach, and found Lord Drummond within minutes. "I heard there was a scene," he said. "A minor one," Drummond replied. Tull looked across the room at Thomasine. Something passed behind his eyes that was not pleasant. "She looks unhurt. She is. Remarkably. And Callery." Lord Drummond turned his brandy glass slowly in his hand. "He is being chivalrous. It will pass." Tull watched the Duke for a moment. Then he watched Thomasine. Then he smiled the way men smile when they are thinking about problems and solutions at the same time. "She is still his ward?" he asked. "Until I decide otherwise." Tull nodded slowly. "Then you still have all the control you need." Lord Drummond said nothing, but his grip on his brandy glass tightened just slightly. On the other side of the room, Duke Callery was laughing at something Captain Rowe had said. He looked perfectly at ease. He looked like a man having an ordinary evening at his own estate. But his eyes, when they moved across the room, always came back to the same place. The girl by the fire. The girl who had stopped expecting anyone to come. He was beginning to understand, in the way that clever men understand things before they have all the facts, that tonight was not an accident, that the door had not closed by chance, that the cold had been chosen for her deliberately, and the understanding was settling into him the way his coat had settled around her shoulders, quietly and completely, with the weight of something that would not easily be removed. The ball ended at midnight. The candles burned low, the music slowed, and the guests began the careful business of departing, gathering wraps and exchanging final pleasantries with the practiced grace of people who had been doing this their whole lives. Carriages were called. Footmen moved efficiently through the thinning crowd. The white roses on the staircase had begun to droop slightly at the edges, and the spiced wine smell had faded to something quieter and more tired. Thomasine stood near the entrance hall, waiting. She was waiting because Lord Drummond had not yet called for their carriage, and she did not leave without his permission. That was one of the rules. There were many rules. She had memorized all of them years ago, the way you memorize the location of sharp things in a dark room. Henrietta walked past her without a glance. Victoire walked past her with a glance that said everything and nothing at the same time. Dorinda walked past and looked briefly at the floor. Thomasine stood straight and kept her expression pleasant and counted the minutes. Captain Phineas Rowe appeared at her left side with the naturalness of someone who had simply been walking in that direction. "Your guardian is in the east study," he said, not looking at her. "He has been there for the past 20 minutes with Viscount Grain and Sir Radley Pemstone." Thomasine absorbed this without changing her expression. Lord Bexham Tull arrived and joined them 10 minutes ago, Roe added. Why are you telling me this? She asked quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I think you should know what room you are standing outside of. She understood him. He meant it in the larger sense. He meant she should understand the shape of the thing surrounding her, not just the part she could see directly. She had always known the shape of it. She had just never had anyone acknowledge it out loud before. I have known the shape of this room for 7 years, she said. Roe turned to look at her properly for the first time. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, closer to recognition, the particular recognition of someone who had seen quiet endurance before and understood its cost. Callery wants to speak with you before you leave, he said. That will cause problems for me. I know. He knows. He's asking anyway. She thought about it. She thought about Drummond in the East study, with 4 men whose combined influence could flatten most obstacles in this county. She thought about Henrietta's smile coming back. She thought about 7 years of careful silence, and all the things it had not protected her from anyway. Tell him 5 minutes, she said, in the main hall where people can still see. Roe nodded and left. She had chosen the location deliberately, public enough that Drummond could not later claim anything inappropriate had occurred, brief enough that she could not be accused of seeking the Duke's attention. She had learned long ago that, when navigating the Drummond household, everything you did had to be defensible in advance. The main hall was nearly empty now. A few lingering guests, 2 footmen extinguishing candles, the quiet settling of a house after a long evening. Duke Callery arrived within 2 minutes, which told her Roe had gone directly to him. He did not waste time on pleasantries. Your name is Thomasine Bewley, he said. Your father was Bernard Bewley, who died 7 years ago and left you in the guardianship of Lord Percival Drummond, who was your father's business associate. She stared at him. You investigated me in the past hour. Birch is thorough and fast. Yes. He did not apologize for it. Your father left a modest estate, property in Hertfordshire, a small fund held in trust. Under the terms of guardianship, Drummond manages it until you marry or reach to 25. The blood in her face moved somewhere colder. You did not know, he said. It was not a question. I knew there was a trust, she said carefully. I didn't know the terms. You turned 25 in 4 months. The silence between them filled up very quickly with the weight of 4 months and 7 years, and all the space between them. She understood it now with a clarity that arrived like cold water. The door tonight had not been casual cruelty. It had not been Henrietta indulging a meanness. It had been something more deliberate. 4 months away from losing control of her money and her future, Lord Drummond had arranged for her to freeze outside his host's estate in the middle of winter. If she had not been found, if the Duke had not stepped out for air at precisely that moment, her hands were very steady. She was proud of that. What do you intend to do with this information? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. That depends on what you intend to do. It was the right answer. She had not expected the right answer. She had expected him to tell her what would happen next, the way powerful men always told you what would happen next, as though your preferences were a detail to be noted and then politely ignored. I do not know yet, she said honestly. He nodded. Then know this. Whatever you decide, you will not face it without options. I will see to that. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to understand what motivated a duke to involve himself in the quiet disaster of a ward's life at his own winter ball. But she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her, and she knew without turning whose they were. She had memorized the sound of Lord Drummond's walk years ago. It was part of survival. She turned. Lord Drummond stood at the corridor entrance with Viscount Grain, 2 steps behind him, and the expression of a man who was perfectly in control of every room he walked into. "Thomasine," he said pleasantly, "I have been looking for you. The carriage is ready." He did not acknowledge the Duke immediately, which was its own kind of message. Duke Callery acknowledged him instead. "Drummond, I was just thanking Miss Bewley for her patience this evening after that unfortunate incident with the door. Yes, a dreadful thing." Drummond's grey eyes moved to Thomasine with warmth so manufactured it nearly had a seam. "Are you quite recovered, my dear?" "My dear." She had heard him use that tone before. It meant she was being watched very carefully and should respond correctly. "Perfectly, thank you," she said. "Wonderful." He held out his arm, the picture of a caring guardian, and she took it because the alternative in this moment cost more than she could pay. She looked back once as Drummond led her toward the entrance. The Duke was watching. Captain Rowe had appeared on his shoulder. Between the 2 of them was a conversation happening in the language of small gestures and settled expressions that she could not fully read, but felt the shape of anyway. It felt like something was beginning. Outside, the cold air hit her again, but differently this time. The Drummond carriage waited, dark and practical, and Henrietta was already inside it with Victoire somehow, the invitation extended without anyone asking Thomasine whether that was agreeable. It was never asked. Henrietta looked at her as she climbed in and said nothing. The nothing was its own message. The nothing said that tonight had not gone as planned, but tomorrow was a longer game, and she was very patient. The carriage moved. Thomasine sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and watched the lights of Callery Estate disappear through the small carriage window. She was still wearing his coat. She had forgotten. Or perhaps she hadn't forgotten. Perhaps she had held on to it, the way you hold on to something warm when you are not sure what the night will feel like when you finally let go of it. Lord Drummond, sitting across from her, noticed. His eyes dropped to the coat, then rose to her face, then moved to the window. He said nothing. That nothing was different from Henrietta's nothing. It was heavier. It had more rooms in it. Thomasine kept her hands very still in her lap, and thought about 4 months and property in Hertfordshire, and the exact sound her father had made when he laughed, which she could still hear perfectly when she tried, even after 7 years. She would not lose what he had left her. She had decided that somewhere between the fire and the front door of Callery Estate. She had decided it quietly and completely, and now the decision sat in her chest like a small, hard coal, and she intended to keep it burning. In the east study of Callery Estate, which was now empty of guests and lit only by the dying fire, Duke Ashton Callery sat at his desk and looked at the single page of notes Birch had placed before him. Beside him, Phineas Rowe stood with his arms folded and the expression he wore when he was angry on someone else's behalf, which was a specific and recognizable expression that the Duke had seen many times. "Drummond has been mismanaging the trust for years," Rowe said. "It is almost certainly not what her father intended." "No," the Duke agreed. "He was planning to have her removed before she could claim it." "Yes." "Tonight was the beginning of that." "Yes." The Duke turned the page over once. She knew none of the terms. She knew the trust existed. She did not know it reverted to her at 25, which means he deliberately kept that from her. For 7 years. Rowe was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do we do?" The Duke looked at the fire. "We find out exactly how much has been taken," he said, "and then we decide what to do about the man who took it." It was said quietly, which was how the Duke said most things. But Rowe, who had known him for 12 years, heard everything underneath the quiet. He uncrossed his arms. "I will start in the morning," he said. 3 days passed. Drummond House was a large and well-appointed townhouse at the better end of a respectable street, and from the outside It looked exactly like what Lord Drummond wanted people to think it was, the home of a prosperous, orderly, well-managed family. Inside, it was something else. Inside, it was a household organized entirely around the comfort and authority of one man, and everything else, every person, every schedule, every conversation, arranged itself around that center, the way planets arrange themselves around something with too much gravity to argue with. Thomasine had spent 3 days being invisible. This was not unusual. She was often invisible in Drummond House, but this invisibility had a different texture to it. It was watchful. She could feel Drummond's attention on her even when he was not in the room, the way you feel weather changing before you can see it. Henrietta had been quiet, which was more unsettling than her noise. Victoire had visited twice, and spent both visits watching Thomasine from across the drawing room, with the thoughtful expression of someone revising a plan. The only moment of relief came on the second day, when a note arrived. It was delivered by a boy she did not recognize, folded simply, sealed with plain wax, and addressed in handwriting she had not seen before. The housekeeper, Mrs. Galt, handed it to her, with the slightly narrowed expression she reserved for things that were out of the ordinary. Thomasine pocketed it without changing her face, and read it in the privacy of her small room on the upper floor. It said, "A solicitor named Thorne on Garrett Street knows your father's file. He was your father's man, not Drummond's. He has been waiting for you to come of age. He does not know you were never told." There was no signature. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it inside the lining of her winter cloak where nobody would find it. She thought about who had sent it. It could have been Roe. It could have been the Duke's man, Birch. It could have been someone else entirely, someone she had not yet identified, who was watching the situation from a different angle. She did not know. What she knew was that the information felt real, and that she intended to verify it. The question was how to get to Garrett Street without being followed. Drummond House was not a prison in the formal sense. She was not locked in her room. She was not prevented from going out. But her movements were noticed and occasionally commented upon, and the servants, most of them, reported to either Mrs. Galt or Henrietta, and Mrs. Galt reported to Lord Drummond. The household was a net, and she had been moving carefully inside it for years. She needed an ordinary reason to be out. On the third day, the ordinary reason arrived in the form of Mabel. Mabel O'Say was the daughter of a local apothecary, and had been Thomasine's only real friend since they had met at a lending library 4 years ago, and discovered a shared enthusiasm for novels that the lending library considered questionable. Mabel was warm and direct, and had an instinctive dislike of Lord Drummond that she had expressed clearly and without apology from the first time she met him, which Thomasine had found both alarming and deeply satisfying. Mabel arrived at the front door with a book she claimed to be returning, which was a book Thomasine had never lent her, which was their signal. Mrs. Galt received her in the entrance hall. Thomasine came downstairs and greeted Mabel with the appropriate warmth of a young lady receiving a call, and within 20 minutes they were outside together, walking toward the lending library, entirely unremarkably. "The note came from the Duke's house," Mabel said the moment they were clear of the street. "I do not know how I know that, but I do. It had that kind of writing, educated and unhurried." "It might have been the captain," Thomasine said. "Either way, it is pointing you somewhere useful." Mabel glanced sideways at her. "You are going to Garrett Street. I need to know what my father actually left me." "I know." Mabel nodded once. "I will walk with you." Garrett Street was a narrow, quiet road of professional offices, the sort of place where important paperwork lived in stacked files, and men in spectacles managed the quiet machinery of inheritance and property. The office of Mr. Aldous Thorne, solicitor, was on the ground floor of a building that smelled of paper and old wood and took itself very seriously. Mr. Thorne was a man of perhaps 60, with a neat white beard and eyes that had seen a great deal and retained all of it. When Thomasine gave her name, He went very still for a moment, and then he stood up from his desk with the energy of a much younger man. "Miss Bewley," he said, "I have been hoping you would come for 3 years." She sat across from him with Mabel beside her, and he placed a file on the desk between them. And for the next 40 minutes she learned the true shape of what her father had left her. It was not modest. The property in Hertfordshire was substantial, a working estate with tenant farmers and a house that had been well maintained because Drummond had been renting it to a family for income that had gone entirely into his own accounts for the past 5 years. The trust fund was 3 times larger than she had vaguely imagined. Her father had also left a letter, sealed and entrusted to Thorne, to be opened when she came of age or came in person. She opened it with hands that were not entirely steady. Her father's handwriting was the same as she remembered, careful and clear, the writing of a man who took words seriously. He told her he was sorry he could not be there. He told her he had tried to choose a guardian who would be trustworthy. He told her he had not known Drummond well enough. He told her the terms of the trust were clear, everything to her at 25, and that Thorne would fight any challenge to that with every resource available because he had been paid handsomely in advance to do exactly that. He told her he loved her. She put the letter down on Thorne's desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Mabel put a hand on her arm and said nothing, which was exactly right. "Drummond has drawn from the rental income," Thorne said carefully. "And there are 2 withdrawals from the trust in the past 18 months that I have been unable to account for. I believe he intended to drain as much as possible before your 25th birthday." "Can it be recovered?" she asked. "With the right legal action, a significant portion, yes." He paused. "But Lord Drummond has resources and connections. He will resist. It will be a difficult process." "How difficult?" Thorne looked at her steadily. "Difficult enough that having a powerful advocate would considerably improve your position." She thought of the Duke's voice in the main hall of Callery Estate. "Whatever you decide, you will not face it without options." She looked at Mabel, who looked back with the direct expression of someone who had already reached a conclusion and was waiting for you to catch up. "There is something else," Thorne said. He reached into the file and placed a second document on the table. "Lord Drummond filed papers 8 days ago, before the ball." She looked at the document. It was a petition to extend his guardianship past her 25th birthday on the grounds of mental and emotional instability, citing specific incidents in which Thomasine had allegedly behaved in ways that made independent management of her affairs inadvisable. The incidents were fabricated, all of them. She recognized the shape of them as things that had actually happened, but described in language so twisted they had become their opposites. A disagreement at dinner was listed as a violent outburst. A request to visit Mabel unsupervised was listed as an attempt to consort with an inappropriate company. The evening of the winter ball was already included, described as her wandering outside in a disturbed state, requiring the intervention of the household. She read every word of it. Then she set it down and looked at Thorne. "When does this need to be answered?" she asked. 6 weeks. 6 weeks, 10 days before her birthday. Outside on Garrett Street, the afternoon light was fading, and the cold was coming back with the patience of something that lived in winter and did not tire of it. Mabel stood close beside her and didn't say anything immediately, and Thomasine was grateful for the silence because she needed a moment to let the full shape of it settle. Drummond had not just planned to drain her inheritance, he had planned to take her future entirely. He had started building the paperwork before the ball, which meant the cold garden and the locked door had been part of something larger. If she had come inside, looking frightened and unstable, or if she had been found later. Worse, for the cold, it would have become one more incident in his file, one more proof of her fragility. Instead, she had been found by a duke. Instead, she was standing outside a solicitor's office with a letter from her dead father and the knowledge of exactly what had been taken from her and exactly who had taken it. She thought of Lord Drummond's face in the carriage, his eyes on the coat she was still wearing. He had known she had spoken to the Duke. He had known the evening had not gone the way he planned. He had recalculated. She needed to move faster than his recalculation. "I need to get a message to Callery Estate," she said. Mabel reached into her own pocket and produced a card with an address. Thomasine looked at her. "The captain gave it to me at the ball," Mabel said, with the composure of someone who had been holding that card for 3 days and waiting for exactly this moment. "He said to use it when she was ready." Thomasine stared at her friend. "You met Captain Rowe at the ball?" "Briefly. He is very direct for a captain." "Mabel. He seemed trustworthy." Mabel looked entirely unrepentant. "And he had honest eyes." Thomasine looked at the card. Then she looked up at the pale winter sky and let out a breath that turned to mist in the cold air. Then she started walking. She had 4 months. She had a solicitor. She had a file full of evidence, a letter in her dead father's handwriting, and a card with an address. She had Mabel, which had always counted for more than most things. She had the coat, which she still had not returned. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in an estate that had already changed the shape of her life once this week, she had a duke who had said she would not face it without options. She intended to hold him to that. The message reached Callery Estate before evening. Birch placed it on the Duke's desk within the hour. The Duke read it, standing. Rowe watched his expression move through several quiet stages and settle into something that looked like controlled fury wrapped in absolute calm. "She found Thorn," the Duke said. "Good," Rowe replied. "Drummond filed the petition 8 days ago, before the ball." He set the note down. He was building the case before he arranged the door. Rowe straightened. The whole evening was planned. The door was meant to give him an incident, a ward found, wandering in a disturbed state at a public event, something to add to his file. The Duke moved to the window. Instead, she was found by the host, which destroyed the incident entirely. It did more than that. It connected her to someone who could actually help her, which is why he is moving faster now. He turned from the window. "Birch, I need Thorn's full documentation by morning. I need Lord Justice, Cranwell, who owes me a favour. And I need every asset Drummond has moved in the past 2 years." Birch nodded and disappeared. Rowe reached for his coat. "I will go to her." "Not yet." The Duke stopped him. "If Drummond sees you at his door, he moves tonight. She needs to come here. I am going to give her a reason that even Drummond cannot question." Rowe waited. "I am returning her a book," the Duke said. Rowe stared at him. "You do not have her book. Birch will find one. That is the flimsiest excuse I have ever heard in my life. It will work." Something in the Duke's tone was lighter than it had been all week, brief and almost warm, like a window cracked open in winter, just long enough to remember what outside smelled like. Rowe sat back down. The carriage reached Drummond House within the hour. Birch had produced a volume of botanical illustrations from somewhere, and the Duke arrived at the front door, holding it with the composure of a man conducting entirely ordinary business. Thomasine came downstairs. Henrietta had heard the name announced and was visible in the drawing-room doorway, very still, absorbing every detail. Thomasine greeted him with the appropriate formality of a ward receiving a caller. "How kind of you, Your Grace," she said. "I was passing," he said, which was almost certainly untrue. He handed her the book. "I also wanted to inquire after your health." "Quite restored, thank you." "Excellent." He paused exactly the right amount. "I am hosting an informal supper Thursday evening. I would be glad if Lord Drummond's household would attend." It was perfectly constructed. An invitation to the entire household, nothing that could be refused without offending a duke who had already shown public concern for their ward. Henrietta could not talk Drummond out of it without explaining why, and explaining why meant explaining the door. "I will pass the invitation to Lord Drummond," Thomasine said. Much appreciated. He looked at her once, directly, with the steady quality she was beginning to recognize as simply how he regarded people he was taking seriously. I hope to see you Thursday, Miss Bewley. He left. She went upstairs and opened the book. Inside the front cover, tucked between the first page and the binding, was a folded note. 3 lines. Thorn will have everything ready. Cranwell has agreed to hear the petition challenge privately. Come Thursday, and bring what you have. She sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling. She thought about her father, who had been a careful man and a loving one, and who had trusted the wrong person with everything important. She thought about what it meant that people were moving on her behalf right now, in offices and law chambers, people who had decided without being asked that what had been done to her was wrong, and that wrong things should be answered. She was not used to that. She had been managing alone so long that the presence of help felt like a language she recognized, but had not spoken in years. She let herself feel it carefully, the way you test ice before putting your weight on it. Then she felt it fully. Then she got up and began preparing for Thursday. Thursday arrived, grey and cold. Drummond House spent the day in careful preparation. Henrietta had been pleasantly quiet all week, which was more unsettling than her noise. Victoire sent a note declining on health grounds. Lord Drummond accepted the invitation without hesitation, because refusing a duke without cause was socially impossible, and because he believed he could manage any room he walked into. He had been managing rooms his whole life. What he had not considered was that this room had been arranged by someone more patient than him. They arrived at 7. The gathering was small, perhaps 20 people, intimate in feeling, but precise in construction. Captain Rowe was there. Birch moved efficiently in the background. Lord Justice Cranwell stood near the fireplace, compact and hawk-eyed, and not easily impressed by anything. Beside him was a woman Thomasine had not met before, tall, self-possessed, introduced simply as Mrs. Lavinia Crewe, a widow with a circuit judge father and a barrister husband, both of which she wore lightly and used exactly when needed. Mabel had been separately invited and arrived looking entirely calm. Lord Drummond worked the room with his usual skill. He found Cranwell, exchanged professional greetings, found grain, and found a glass. He felt in control of the evening. He was not in control of the evening. Supper was served at 8. Thomasine was seated 2 places from Cranwell, and directly across from the Duke. Drummond was placed at the far end, between guests he did not know, which was not accidental. The food was good. The conversation was general. Halfway through the second course, Drummond looked down the table at Thomasine. She met his eyes. He looked away first. She noted it, and kept eating. After supper, the company moved to the sitting room, and it was here that the evening changed. Cranwell settled into a chair near Thomasine, with the unhurried manner of a man beginning an ordinary conversation. The Duke positioned himself nearby. Mrs. Crewe arrived on her other side. Rowe stood near the door. Drummond, across the room with grain, felt the geometry shift and looked up. Cranwell said clearly and conversationally, "Miss Bewley, I understand you recently visited Mr. Aldous Thorn." "I did, my lord." "And you were made aware of your father's trust terms." "I was." Drummond moved across the room fast, arriving with a smile carrying too many teeth. "Cranwell, I was not aware this was a professional consultation," he said lightly. "It is supper," Cranwell replied. "I enjoy good conversation." He looked up at Drummond with the tranquil eyes of a man who had spent 40 years refusing to be managed. "Sit down, Percival." The first name. Flat, without ceremony. Drummond sat. Cranwell laid out what Thorn had found. The rental income was drawn over 5 years. The trust withdrawals, the petition and its procedural failures. Each item presented as arithmetic, not accusation, facts accumulating like stones, building a wall that Drummond could see himself standing on the wrong side of. Drummond tried to redirect 3 times. Each time he was answered precisely and finally, once by Cranwell, Once by Mrs. Crewe, once by the simple fact of Thorne arriving quietly from the back of the room with the complete file in his hands. The third time, Drummond looked at Thomasine and said, with the manufactured warmth she had always recognized, that he had only ever acted in her best interest. She reached into a bag and placed her father's letter on the table between them. She said nothing. Drummond looked at the handwriting. Something moved across his face. Not remorse. The recognition of a man who had finally run out of room. Cranwell placed 2 documents beside the letter. The petition, suspension. The trust, restoration accounting. Both require Drummond's signature to remain out of court. "I will not offer this alternative twice," Cranwell said. Drummond looked at the documents. He looked at Thomasine. She looked back with an expression that had taken 7 years to develop. Not hatred, not triumph. Simply clarity, the expression of someone who finally sees a thing as it actually is. He picked up the pen and signed both documents. The room breathed. Cranwell gathered the papers efficiently, shook the Duke's hand, nodded to Mrs. Crewe, and departed with Thorne. Drummond stood, looked once at his daughter, looked once at Thomasine, and left. Grain followed 2 minutes later, having repositioned himself socially on his way out the door. Henrietta remained. She was sitting near Mabel, and had been for the past hour, and whatever Mabel had said to her during that time had made the chair she was sitting in noticeably uncomfortable. It was over. The main part of it, at least. The sitting room settled. The guests who had maintained their tact all evening found easier corners and quieter conversations. Someone played something gentle on the pianoforte next door. The fire burned well. The house had the particular peace of a long evening finding its natural close. Thomasine sat still for a moment. Mabel sat beside her and said simply, "It is done." "The main part," Thomasine said. "Yes, the main part." She was aware of the Duke crossing the room before she saw it, the way you become aware of warmth before turning toward it. He sat in the chair Cranwell had vacated and looked at her with the same unhurried attention he had given her since the night in the snow. "How are you?" he asked. Such a simple question. After everything. After 7 years and a locked door and a petition built from fabricated incidents and a father's letter she had carried tonight as the truest thing she owned. She considered the answer honestly. "I do not know yet," she said. "I think it will take time to understand what I am now, that I am not what I was." He nodded. "That is reasonable." "You made this possible," she said. "All of it. I want you to know I understand that." "You made it possible," he said. "You walked to Garrett Street. You opened the letter. You came tonight. I arranged a room. You filled it." He was not being modest for effect. He was being accurate. That was the difference with him. The things he said were precise. Not kind in the way that softened truth, but kind in the way that told it fully. She looked at her hands. "I have a house in Hertfordshire," she said. It still felt strange to say. "I have never seen it. It is a good house. 3 tenant farms, well managed. The grounds are considerable." She looked up. "You asked Birch about my house." "I ask Birch about most things." "What else did you ask him?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I asked him what your father was like." She was not prepared for that. Her throat tightened. "What did he find?" she asked. "That Bernard Bewley was a self-made man who kept his word, generous to his tenants, honest in business, devoted to his daughter. Birch spoke to 2 people who knew him personally. Both said the same thing without being prompted, that he spent his last years making sure you would be all right." She looked at the fire. She thought about the letter, the careful handwriting, the apology for not being there, the love in every line of it, unhurried and complete, the love of someone who had known they were running out of time and had used what remained to make sure she would arrive. She had not been all right, but that had not been her father's failure. "He would have liked this house," she said. "Then you should visit it soon," the Duke said. "It is yours." She looked at him. The fire moved between them, and the music drifted softly from the next room, and the house held them both in the quiet of a long evening, finally resting. She had spent 7 years making herself invisible, moving carefully through rooms that were not hers, managing the temperatures of people who held power over her, learning the geography of cruelty and navigating it daily with the precision of someone who could not afford a single wrong step. She did not yet know what it felt like to move through a room without all of that. She thought it might take some learning. She thought, looking at the man across from her, that she might not have to learn it entirely alone. "I still have your coat," she said. Something lived near his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same space. "I know. I should return it." "You could," he said, "or you could keep it until spring, at which point I will collect it myself." She looked at him carefully. "That is a very long time to collect a coat." "I am in no particular hurry," he said. And there it was. Not a declaration, not a performance for a watching room. Simply a man saying plainly that he intended to keep showing up, quietly and without conditions, for as long as it was wanted. It was the most serious thing anyone had ever said to her, and also the least frightening, precisely because it asked nothing in return. She let it settle. She let the warmth of it arrive the way warmth does when you have been cold long enough that you stop moving away from it. Across the room, Mabel was saying something to Captain Rowe that made him laugh genuinely for the first time all evening. Mrs. Crewe and Thorne stood near the door, already planning the legal restoration, with the quiet satisfaction of people who are very good at their work, and have just proved it. Henrietta sat with her own thoughts, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had done all season. Thomasine looked at the botanical book still in her hands. She thought about her father, about the letter sealed in a solicitor's office for 7 years, waiting for her to arrive and claim it. He had known she would arrive. He had trusted that completely, put it in writing, paid a man handsomely to hold it until she did. She had arrived. That was the thing. After 7 years of locked doors and manufactured cruelty, and a future that had been quietly stolen piece by piece, she had arrived anyway. Not because it had been easy, not because anyone had cleared the path, but because she was made of the kind of thing that keeps going even when going costs everything. She looked at the Duke. He was watching the fire with the composed peace of a man settled in his own evening. He felt her looking and turned. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You are welcome, Miss Bewley." She said, "Thomasine." He looked at her with something that lived just beneath warmth, in the place where warmth goes when it has decided to stay. He said, "Thomasine." Just her name. Her own name, given back to her by someone who had gone to considerable trouble to understand what it belonged to. She turned back to the fire. She did not smile. She did something quieter, something in the place underneath, smiling where relief and hope arrive together when they have been kept waiting a long time. Outside, the winter held steady against the windows, cold and patient as always, but the fire inside was good, and the music was gentle, and the room was full of people who had chosen to be on the right side of something tonight, and had not regretted it. Thomasine Bewley sat in a warm chair in a house that had changed her life twice in 1 week, and felt, for the first time in 7 years, the particular and extraordinary ordinary feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be, not performing, not managing, not surviving, just present, unafraid, entirely herself. And outside in the corridor, on a hook near the east entrance, a duke's coat hung waiting for a spring that was still months away, which suited everyone involved perfectly. If this story reached something in you, we want to know which moment hit hardest. Was it the letter from her father, the signed documents, or the coat that was never returned? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If Thomasin's story deserved every bit of the fight, please hit the subscribe button. We have more stories waiting, and you do not want to miss them.